I shot a Sasquatch on my trapline in the winter of 1966 out on the Allagash country of northern Maine. And I want to tell you right now that pulling that trigger is the thing I regret most in 81 years of living. What I found in the snow beside it once the shot had settled and the woods had gone quiet again is the reason I never trapped that stretch of river again, and the reason I spent the next 4 decades trying to make it right. I was 30 years old. I had a game warden's respect, a wife waiting up with the lamp lit, and a rifle I had carried since I was 14. None of that mattered once I saw what was lying in the snow next to the body. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Wilfred Michaud. Everybody who knew me called me Wilf except my mother, who called me Wilfred right up until she passed because she said a shortened name was a lazy man's name, and she was not a woman who tolerated laziness in any form. I was born in 1936 in the town of Fort Kent, Maine, at the very top of Aroostook County, where the St. John River marks the border with New Brunswick, and the winters come down out of Quebec like they own the place. My father, Alcide Michaud, ran a trapline on the Maine side of the river for 31 years, and his father had run one before him, and by the time I was 7 years old, I could set a body-gripping trap in the dark with my mittens on, because that is simply what a Michaud boy learned to do before he learned much of anything else, a family trade passed down with the same seriousness other families reserved for a farm or a shop. My father did not hand me that trapline all at once. It came to me as most things came to a Michaud boy, in pieces, over years, each piece earned before the next was given. I was 6 the first time he let me carry his pack basket for a half-mile of easy ground near town, and I was 7 before he trusted me with a trap of my own, a small #1 long spring set for muskrat along a ditch behind our house on the edge of Fort Kent. I caught nothing that first season, though I checked that trap nearly every day after school, walking the quarter-mile in whatever weather the sky offered, because my father had told me a trapper who does not check his line regularly is not a trapper at all, just a man who owns some steel. I was 9 when he took me out on the real line for the first time, up along the lower stretch near the 9 Mile Bridge, and I remember the cold of that first morning more clearly than I remember most of what happened in my 20s. He walked ahead of me on snowshoes I had only worn a handful of times, and I fell twice in the first mile. And both times he waited without a word until I got myself back up, because he believed a boy who is helped up too quickly never learns to trust his own legs. By the time I was 12, I could set a full run of body-gripping traps along a beaver flowage without supervision, and by 14, the year I got my own rifle, my father had started leaving me alone on short stretches of the line for 2 and 3 days at a stretch while he worked the rest of it himself. He was a hard man to read, but not a hard man to love, if that makes sense to you. And I have spent a good part of my own old age trying to be that same kind of steady presence for Mark and for Michelle, with what success I will leave for them to judge. He did not talk much, and what talking he did was mostly about the woods, about weather patterns and animal sign and the particular character of one stretch of river against another. But underneath that quiet there was a steadiness I have spent the rest of my life trying to match. My mother used to say he had 2 speeds, working and sleeping, and that anyone who wanted a third speed out of him was wasting their breath asking, a description that always made him chuckle despite himself whenever she said it in front of company. She was not entirely wrong, though I think she underestimated how much he carried inside that steadiness, given what I would eventually learn about the winter of 1939. I finished high school in Fort Kent in 1954, one of maybe 30 boys in my graduating class, and half of them went straight into the woods just as I did, either for the paper companies as cutters or, in my case, onto a trap line that had been Michaud property in all but legal deed for 2 generations. I did 2 years of seasonal work for Great Northern Paper as a cruiser's helper before my father decided I was ready to take on a stretch of the line under my own name. And by 1958, at 22, I was running close to 15 miles of trap line on my own each winter while he kept the rest, a fuller mental map of that whole stretch of Aroostook County than most trappers my age ever developed. I want to tell you about a close call I had in the winter of 1961, 5 years before Musquacook, because I think it matters to understanding how I read that country by the time 1966 came around. I was working a stretch near a set of beaver flowages north of the 9 Mile Bridge, checking a line of sets in a hard January cold snap when I broke through thin ice on a small feeder stream I thought I knew well enough to trust. I went into my waist, the current pulling at my legs in that particular way moving water does even under ice, and it took me the better part of 20 minutes alone 4 miles from the nearest cabin to work myself back onto solid footing with my clothes already stiffening in the cold. I made it back to the cabin that night more by stubbornness than by skill, and I built a fire and sat shaking in front of it for 2 hours before I trusted my hands enough to make coffee. I tell you that story because it is the closest I had come before 1966 to understanding that this country could kill me on any given day if I stopped respecting it for even a few minutes, and I carried that lesson with me every season after, right up until a night when it was not the cold or the water that nearly broke me.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The North Woods of Maine are not the kind of forest most people picture when they hear the word wilderness. There are no mountains rising sharp against the sky the way you get out west. What you get instead is an ocean of spruce and fir and tamarack that rolls on for better than 2 million acres, cut through by rivers with names like the Allagash and the St. John and the Aroostook, and broken here and there by bog country so thick with black spruce that a man can walk 100 yards and lose all sense of which way is north. Winters there run long and hard, the kind of cold that settles into the joints of a man by January and does not fully leave until the ice goes out on the rivers sometime in April. And a person who has not spent a season in that country tends to underestimate just how much distance and how much silence exists between one human settlement and the next. Fort Kent, where I grew up, sits at what people in the rest of the state half-jokingly call the top of Maine, closer to the Canadian border than to any city most Americans would recognize by name, and the land north and west of it, running toward the Allagash, is some of the least populated ground east of the Mississippi River. In 1966, most of that land belonged to the paper companies, Great Northern and International Paper among them, and they let trappers work it so long as a man kept his mouth shut about the logging roads and didn't burn anything down. My father had a handshake arrangement with the land agent for a company out of Millinocket, and when he got too old to run the line himself, that arrangement passed to me just as the line itself did, without a single piece of paper changing hands. I trapped beaver, muskrat, otter, fisher, and marten, mostly along a 40-mile stretch of country that ran from a set of ponds south of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway down toward the 9 Mile Bridge on the St. John. It was hard, cold, solitary work, and I loved it in a way I never managed to explain to my wife, Yvette, who thought I was half out of my mind for choosing 3 weeks alone in a cabin over a warm house and her cooking. We had been married 2 years by the winter I'm telling you about. She was pregnant with our first child, a fact that matters later in this story more than I can say right now, so hold on to it. Everything about my presence on that stretch of river in January of 1966 was ordinary, sanctioned, and exactly the kind of work 3 generations of Michaud men had done on that same ground without incident. I want to give you a sense of what a trapline actually was in that country, because I think most people today picture something small, a few snares in a backyard. My line was not that. I had 6 line cabins spaced out along the route, most of them built by my father or his father before him. Simple log structures with a wood stove, a bunk, and enough dry goods to get a man through a week if the weather turned. I ran the line on snowshoes, checking traps every 2 to 4 days, depending on the stretch, and a full circuit of the whole line took me the better part of 3 weeks. I would leave Yvette in November once the ice had set up enough to trust, and I would not see her again except for one supply trip at Christmas until the season closed toward the end of March. That kind of separation asks a great deal of a young marriage, and Yvette carried her share of it without much complaint, though she made sure I knew every March exactly how much she had carried, usually with a look rather than any actual complaint, which I always found harder to argue with than words would have been, and which taught me early that a marriage built around a trapline runs on more patience than most people ever have to spend. The winter of 1965 into 66 had come in hard and stayed that way. By the second week of January, the temperature at my third line cabin, the one we called the Musquacook cabin because it sat near a chain of 3 ponds by that name, had not climbed above 10 degrees in 11 straight days. I remember that specifically because I kept a small logbook the way my father had taught me, recording weather catch and trap condition for every stop on the line. That logbook still exists. It is one of the few pieces of physical evidence I have for what I am about to tell you, and I will get to what is written in it later because what is written in it in my own handwriting from that week still raises the hair on my arms when I read it. Something had been at my traps for close to 2 weeks before the night I am telling you about. It started small. A body-gripping trap set for beaver near the outlet of the second Musquacook pond, turned up empty and sprung, which happens, traps misfire, animals sometimes trigger them without getting caught clean. But then a second trap in the same stretch turned up the same way 2 days later. Then a third. By the second week, I had lost 4 sets in a row along a half-mile run of shoreline, every one of them sprung and empty, and every one of them showing the same thing when I got down on my knees to look close. The chain stakes, which I drove into frozen ground with a maul and which normally took me a good deal of effort to pull, had been yanked clean out of the earth. One of them, a length of case-hardened chain rated for animals up to 80 pounds, had been bent at close to a right angle. I assumed at first it was a bear that had come out of its den early, which does happen in a warm stretch, though we had not had a warm stretch, we had had the opposite. I assumed it might be another trapper poaching my line, which was a serious accusation among trapping families and one I did not make lightly even in my own head. I assumed a lot of things over those 2 weeks, and every one of them fell apart the moment I found the tracks. I found them on the morning of January the 18th, 1966, a Tuesday, cold and clear with maybe 6 inches of fresh powder over a hard crust from a thaw and freeze cycle the week before. The tracks came out of the tree line above the second pond, crossed the open ice in a line as straight as a survey stake, and went back into the timber on the far side. I had trapped and hunted that country my whole life. I had tracked moose, deer, bear, bobcat, and once, memorably, a wolverine that had wandered down out of the Quebec side. I knew what every animal native to that forest left behind in snow. What I was looking at did not belong to any of them. The print was bipedal, meaning it walked on 2 legs, as a man does, not 4. It measured, when I laid my own boot down beside it for comparison, somewhere around 16 inches long, nearly twice the length of my own foot, and it showed 5 toes splayed wide, with a heel strike deep enough that I could have set my whole gloved fist down inside the depression and not touch bottom. The stride length, meaning the distance from one print to the next, was close to 5 feet, which meant whatever made it was covering ground at a pace no human being could match on packed snow, wearing nothing on its feet because there was no boot pattern, no tread, nothing but bare skin pressed into crystal. I did not have a camera with me that day, which I have regretted for 60 years, because a photograph of that track line taken fresh with clean edges and good morning light would have settled a question that has followed me my whole life. What I had instead was my logbook. And I got down on my knees in the snow and I sketched that print as best I could, and I wrote the measurements in pencil, And underneath the sketch, I wrote 3 words that I still remember writing because my hand was not quite steady when I wrote them. I wrote, "Not a bear." I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile into the timber before I lost my nerve, or maybe lost my good sense and turned back for the cabin. I want to be honest with you about that moment because there is a temptation in telling a story like this to make yourself out braver than you were. I was not brave that day. I was 30 years old, alone, 4 days from the nearest cabin with a working radio, and I had just found evidence that something large enough to bend hardened steel chain was walking my trapline on 2 legs. I went back to the Musquacook cabin, I banked the stove, and I sat up half the night with my rifle across my knees, listening to a forest that had gone strangely, completely quiet. I want to talk about that quiet for a moment, because it is the detail that has stuck with me longest, longer even than the print itself. The North Woods in January are never silent in the sense most people imagine silence. There is always something. Wind working through spruce boughs, the settling crack of ice on the pond expanding in the cold, the occasional far-off call of a great horned owl working the same territory it worked every winter. That night, none of it. I sat in that cabin from full dark until close to 2 in the morning, and I could not tell you that I heard a single natural sound the entire time. The forest around Musquacook Pond had simply stopped. At around 2, that changed, and it did not make me feel any better. A sound came from somewhere up the ridge behind the cabin, low and drawn out, carrying a resonance that I felt as much in my chest as I heard with my ears. It was not a moose call, which I knew well from a decade of hunting season, that particular grunting bellow a bull moose makes during the rut. It was not a wolf, though wolves were rare that far south by 1966, and I had only heard one twice in my life. It lasted maybe 6 seconds, and then it stopped, and about 90 seconds later, from a different direction, further off toward the river, something answered it. Same tone, same low resonance, shorter in duration. I sat there with the stove ticking and my rifle across my knees, and I understood in my gut, before my mind was willing to agree, that there were at least 2 of whatever had left that track line, and they were talking to each other across better than half a mile of frozen forest. I did not sleep that night. In the morning, I found a 5th trap sprung. This one, a good 3/4 mile from the others along a stretch of the line I had not expected trouble to reach. Whatever was working my traps was covering ground fast and covering a lot of it. I want to pause the trapline story for a moment to tell you something about my father because it matters for what comes next. Alcide Michaud had trapped that same stretch of the St. John River drainage for over 3 decades before he handed the line to me, and in all that time he had told me exactly one story about something he would not explain. It happened when I was maybe 9 years old, sitting at our kitchen table in Fort Kent while my mother did dishes, and my father, who was not a man given to tall tales, told me that back in the winter of 1939 he had come across a set of tracks near the same Musquacook chain of ponds that he could not account for. He described them almost exactly as I would describe mine to him 27 years later, though at the time I was 9 and did not understand why he told the story with his jaw set so tight, or why my mother stopped washing dishes and went very still while he told it. He never repeated the story after that night. When I asked him about it years later as a grown man with my own line to run, he told me some things in these woods were better left to walk their own path without a man's curiosity chasing after them. I did not understand what he meant until January of 1966. He never repeated the story after that night, but he did tell me a little more of it in the moment before he shut the door on the subject for good, and I have carried those details with me the same way I carried everything else from that winter. He said the tracks he found in 1939 were smaller than what I would describe to him later, closer to 12 inches by his recollection, in that he had followed them for the better part of a morning before losing them on a stretch of wind-scoured ledge above the second pond. He said he never saw what made them. He said the only other thing he would say about it, and he said it looking past me at the window rather than at my face, was that he had heard 2 nights running that same week a sound from the ridge that he never once heard again in the 30 years he trapped that ground afterward, and that he had chosen right then, standing on that ledge with his own rifle slung and his own heart going hard, to walk away rather than follow it any further. I did not have the sense at 9 years old to ask him why a grown man who had trapped bear and moose his whole life would walk away from a set of tracks rather than see them through. I understand it now better than I would like to. I want to tell you a little more about Yvette before I go further, because she is at the center of everything that happened after that January, and I think you should know her as I knew her before you hear what she went through alongside me. Yvette Levesque grew up in Frenchville, another river town a few miles downstream from Fort Kent, in a family of 10 children, and she trained as a school teacher before we married in 1964. She taught the younger grades at the Fort Kent Elementary School for 2 years before Denise came along, and she had a patience with children, and later with me, that I never fully deserved. She used to say that trapping widowed her every winter and gave her back a stranger every spring, and she was not entirely wrong about that, though the winter of 1966 would prove her more right than either of us expected. Yvette's family deserves more than a passing mention, because her people shaped a good deal of who she became, and who she became shaped how she carried everything I eventually told her. Her father, Napoleon Levesque, ran a small dairy operation outside Frenchville and had lost 2 brothers to the woods trade before Yvette was even born, one to a felling accident and one to influenza during a winter cutting camp in the 20s. Her mother, Alberta, had raised 10 children on that dairy income and whatever the garden and the root cellar could stretch to cover, and Yvette used to say the greatest luxury of her own adult life was a kitchen where she did not have to plan every meal 3 days in advance around what was left in the cellar. She was the 7th of those 10 children, quiet in the manner a person learns in a house that loud, and she carried a competence about her that I noticed the first time I met her at a church supper in Frenchville in the spring of 1963, long before I noticed anything else. We were married the following year in June of 1964 at St. Luce Church in Frenchville, with both our families crowded into pews that had heard the Levesque and Michaud names for 3 generations apiece. I was 28. She was 25. We honeymooned for exactly 2 days at a cabin on Long Lake, because that was what a trapper's income allowed in those years, and Yvette never once complained about it. Not then, and not in the 55 years that followed, though she teased me about it plenty. There is one more thing I should tell you here, because it did not occur to me until years later how much of a warning had already been sitting in plain sight before I ever set foot on that ice. My father's line boss in the early years, a Passamaquoddy man named Joseph Nicola, who worked seasonal cruising jobs for the paper company out of Millinocket, had told my father once, back when my father was a young man just starting to run his own traps, that the old people in his community spoke of a tall, dark-haired figure that lived deep in the timber along the northern drainages, a tall figure covered in dark hair that kept its distance from people and was owed the same respect a person would give to any neighbor whose land bordered your own. My father passed that story to me secondhand, as a person passes along a story they only half believe, and I had filed it away with 100 other bits of woods lore that trappers trade around a stove without putting much weight on any of it. I did not think about Joseph Nicola's warning again until I was kneeling on the ice at Musquacook Pond, with blood freezing black against dark hair, and by then it was far too late to matter for anything except understanding after the fact that I had not stumbled onto anything entirely without precedent. People who had lived on that land far longer than any Michaud had already known enough to leave it alone. The days between finding those first tracks and the night I fired my rifle were some of the longest of my life, and I want to walk you through them slowly because I think the build-up matters as much as the moment itself. On the 19th of January, the day after I found the tracks, I hiked the full length of that stretch of shoreline again in daylight, looking for anything I might have missed the evening before. I found scat, if you can call it that, a pile of digested vegetable matter mixed with what looked like, Winter-killed grouse deposited at the base of a hemlock about 200 yards from the track line, larger in volume than anything a moose or bear would leave and containing none of the hair or bone fragments you would expect from a carnivore's droppings. I did not have a way to test it properly, no field kit, no way to send a sample anywhere without explaining where it came from, so I did the only thing I could do, which was measure it and move on with a knot in my stomach that did not loosen for the rest of that week. On the 21st, 2 days later, I found a section of young birch, maybe 3 inches through, that had been snapped clean at chest height and stripped of its outer bark in long vertical strokes, the kind of damage a porcupine leaves over a season of gnawing, except this had happened overnight, and the tooth marks, where I could find any at all, were too wide set to belong to any rodent I knew. I stood looking at that stripped birch for a long while, and I remember thinking about my father's story from 1939, the one he told once at our kitchen table and never repeated, and wondering for the first time whether whatever he had encountered 30 years earlier had never actually left that stretch of country at all, just gone quiet, keeping his distance from a road it had learned to distrust. I want to back up 2 days before that first track line because there is more to that stretch of building dread than I have told you, and I think the fuller account matters. On the night of the 16th, I woke somewhere past midnight at the Musquacook cabin to the sound of my own dog, a young hound named Baron, that my father had given me as a pup 2 years before and that I had started bringing along on the line for company and for warning. Baron was not a barker by nature, a quiet, steady animal who mostly wanted to sleep near the stove, and the sound he made that night was not his ordinary bark at all, but something lower and longer, closer to a growl held at length than anything I had heard from him before. He would not settle. He stood at the cabin door with his hackles raised and would not stop that low sound until nearly 2 in the morning, and even after he finally quieted, he refused to lie down anywhere except pressed against my legs, which he had never done before and never did again in the 6 more years he lived with me. I did not think much of it at the time beyond a mild unease, the kind any trapper learns to file away without much weight because dogs get spooked by all manner of things in deep woods at night, a porcupine working nearby, an owl, a moose passing closer than either party intended. It was not until after everything else that happened that month that I understood Baron had likely known something was in that country before I ever found the first sign of it myself, and I have wondered many times since what an animal's senses pick up that a man's never will. By the 17th, the day after Baron's strange night, I had still found nothing out of the ordinary on my rounds, though I noted in my logbook that the dog remained unsettled, refusing to range more than a few yards from the cabin even during daylight checks, which was itself unlike him. It was the following morning, the 18th, that I found the first tracks, and looking back at my own logbook now, I can see the pattern laid out in my own handwriting plainer than I ever managed to see it, living through it day by day, the dog's warning 2 full days ahead of any sign I could read with my own eyes. I want to mention one more incident from that buildup because I have never told it to anyone, and it has weighed on me nearly as much as everything else from that January. On the morning of the 22nd, 2 days before the shooting, I found that a sack of dried corn I kept staged outside the cabin door for a bait mixture had been torn open and scattered across the snow, the burlap itself shredded rather than simply chewed, through the way a raccoon or a fisher might have managed it. I stood over that scattered corn in the gray early light and felt, for the first time in that whole ordeal, something closer to being watched than simply being trespassed against. A sensation down the back of my neck that I could not shake for the rest of that day's rounds and that I have never quite managed to fully shake in the 60 years since. On the 23rd, the day before the shooting, I did something I am not proud of and that I have never told anyone until now, not even Yvette. I set a wire snare, not for beaver or marten, but rigged heavier, along the same travel corridor where the traps kept getting sprung, thinking that if I could not see whatever was doing this, I could at least catch a print or a hair sample that would prove to myself and maybe eventually to someone else that I was not losing my mind out there alone. I checked it the following afternoon, the 24th, before I ever took my position in that stand of spruce, and I found the wire snapped clean through, not slipped, not sprung and empty as a trap normally fails, but the cable itself parted like thread, and that was the moment I stopped telling myself I was dealing with anything ordinary and started making the decision that would end that evening on the ice. By the third week of January, I had lost 7 sets total, and the paper company land agent in Millinocket was going to want an accounting of my catch numbers when the season closed, because a poor season reflected on whether they would renew a trapper's access for the following year. I could not report 7 traps lost to an animal nobody would believe existed. I decided, against every instinct my father had ever tried to plant in me, that I was going to find out what was working my line, and I was going to put a stop to it one way or another. The rifle I carried that winter, the Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, was the same rifle I used every deer season, sighted in at 100 yards and capable in a steady hand of taking game cleanly out past 250 yards in good light. In failing light at 40 yards, the range I ended up shooting from, it was more than capable of doing exactly what it did, and I want to be plain about that because I have never once told myself the shot was a fluke or a miss that happened to connect. It was an accurate rifle in a hand that knew how to use it, fired by a man who believed in the half second it mattered that his life depended on pulling the trigger. I picked a stretch of shoreline along the second Musquacook pond where 3 of my sets had already been hit, a natural travel corridor between the pond and a beaver flowage about a quarter-mile back in the timber, the kind of pinch point where an animal moving through the country has to funnel through a narrow band of open ground. I reset 2 traps there, checked my rifle, a Winchester Model 70 chambered in 30-06 that I had carried since I turned 16, and I decided I would sit that stretch on the evening of January the 24th, a Monday, with enough daylight left to get back to the cabin before full dark, if nothing came. I set up in a stand of spruce about 40 yards back from the shoreline, downwind, just as my father had taught me to sit for deer, and I settled in around 3 in the afternoon with the temperature already dropping through the low teens. The light in that country fails fast in January, going from bright to blue to black in under an hour, and by 4:30 I was sitting in near darkness with just enough gray left in the sky to make out the pale line of the pond ice through the trees. It came out of the timber on the far side of the pond at what I judge now to have been close to 5 o'clock, though I did not check a watch at the time because I did not want to risk the motion or the sound. I saw it first as a shape breaking the tree line, tall enough that it did not register right away because my mind kept trying to sort it into a familiar shape, a man standing, a moose browsing, and it fit neither. It crossed the open ice at a walking pace, unhurried, and even in that failing light I could see the gait was wrong for anything I knew, a rolling, unhurried stride, arms swinging loose at its sides, shoulders far too wide for a man, and a head that sat low and forward on those shoulders without much of a neck to speak of. It was covered head to foot in hair, dark, near black in that light, dense enough that I could not make out any skin beneath it anywhere on the body. I would put its height based on comparing it against the 6-foot stakes I had driven at the shoreline to mark my trap sets at somewhere close to 7.5 feet. I sat frozen in that spruce stand with my heart going so hard I was certain it could be heard across the pond, and I watched it walk directly toward my trap line. It reached the first of my 2 reset traps and stopped. It crouched down, and even crouched it was taller than I stood, and it reached toward the trap with one hand, and I heard, even from 40 yards, the distinct metallic snap of a body-gripping trap firing closed. It made a sound then, sharp and short, more surprise than pain as far as I could tell, and it straightened up fast, and that is the moment every clear thought I had been holding on to came apart in my hands. I do not remember deciding to raise the rifle. I remember the heft of it against my shoulder and the cold of the stock through my glove and the shape in my scope dark against a darker tree line, and I remember the thought that went through my head in the half second before I pulled the trigger, which was not a thought at all, really, just a single word repeating, and the word was danger. 30 years old, alone in the dark, 4 miles from the nearest cabin, having just watched something taller than any man I had ever met close a trap on itself and cry out, and every instinct my father and this forest had ever built into me screamed the same thing. I fired. The recoil against my shoulder registered a full second after the sound did, which is the strange way a rifle shot works when adrenaline has already taken most of a man's attention, and I remember the muzzle flash lighting the spruce boughs around me for less than the length of a heartbeat, bright enough that the darkness afterward felt total, as if the woods themselves had briefly gone blind alongside me. The report rolled out across that pond basin and came back once, faint, off the ridge on the far side, an echo I had heard 100 times before on that same stretch of water while hunting deer, and that had never once sounded the way it sounded that evening, final and enormous and impossible to call back. The shot took it high in the chest on the left side, and it went down hard, a sound like a felled tree hitting frozen ground, and then the whole pond basin went silent again, and that silence felt worse than any sound could have. I sat in that spruce stand for what must have been 3 or 4 minutes without moving, my ears ringing, my breath coming in short white clouds, waiting for it to move again, waiting for a second one to come out of the trees the way I had heard them answering each other 2 nights before. Nothing came, no second shape crossed the ice, no answering call rolled down out of the ridge behind me. I made myself stand up. My knees did not want to hold me, and I made them anyway because whatever I had just done, I could not sit in the dark and not know the shape of it. I crossed that pond ice with my rifle up and my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it twice. And the closer I got, the less any of it made sense to me because the shape on the ice was not moving and it was not small, and every step I took toward it felt like walking toward a mistake I could not undo. It was on its back, one arm flung out to the side, the other curled against the chest wound. The hair covering the body was matted dark with blood in the failing light, and up close, kneeling beside it with my breath fogging the air between us, I could see the face clearly for the first time, heavy through the brow, wide through the jaw. And even in death, there was an expression on it that did not match anything I expected to feel looking at an animal. It looked like grief. I know how strange that sounds coming from a man who had never in his life anthropomorphized a catch, who had killed and skinned animals since he was 7 years old without a second thought for what their faces might be saying. This was different, and I felt it different, on my knees on that ice with the temperature dropping through single digits and my own pulse hammering in my ears. I want to try to describe as clearly as I still can at 81 what was going through me in those minutes because I have never managed to say it out loud to anyone, not even Yvette, in quite this much detail. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a mistake you cannot undo, different from ordinary quiet, heavier, the sound of your own blood loud enough in your ears that it feels like the forest itself has gone deaf along with you. I remember looking down at my own hands still gripping that rifle and not recognizing them for a moment as if they belonged to some other man who had made a decision I would never have made myself. I remember the specific absurd detail of noticing that my right glove had a small tear along the seam of the thumb, a mend I had meant to make for 2 weeks and never had, and fixating on that tear the way a mind will sometimes fixate on something small and manageable when the actual thing in front of it is too large to hold all at once. I want to describe a little more of what I saw kneeling beside her that night because I have given you the broad shape of it, but not the particular details that have stayed with me longest. And I think those details matter to understanding why my whole relationship to what I had done shifted the way it did. Her hands, when I finally made myself look at them directly, were not the crude, clawed things a frightened man's imagination might construct in the aftermath of a shooting like that. They were long-fingered, the palms broad, but the digits themselves almost delicate in their proportion, and the nails, where I could see them beneath the dark hair covering the backs of her hands, were flat and closely worn. Not claws at all, but something closer to what a person's own nails look like after decades of hard outdoor work. One hand, the one not curled against her chest wound, was open, fingers slightly spread, resting on the ice in a posture that struck me, even in the state I was in that night, as plainly peaceful rather than defensive. Her face, which I have already told you carried an expression I read as grief, held other details I have never fully described until now. The eyes were closed, which surprised me somehow, though I could not have told you what I expected instead. The brow above them was heavy, pronounced just as every account I would later read described, but the skin around her eyes, where I could see it beneath the coarse dark hair that thinned slightly at the temples, showed the kind of fine creasing a person's face develops with age, the same creasing I would come to recognize on my own father's face and eventually on my own. She was not young. I do not know how such a population measures age among its own kind, but everything about her bearing, the strength evident even in death, the deep creasing around her closed eyes, the slight silvering I noticed at her temples once I looked closely enough, told me I was kneeling beside someone who had lived a long life before that night ended it. That is when I saw the second shape. It was tucked against the body's side, pressed into the curve of the ribs the way a child presses into a parent for warmth small enough that I had missed it entirely. In my first look, dark-haired, the same as the larger one, but no more than 3 feet in length, curled tight with both arms wrapped around itself. I did not understand what I was looking at right away. My mind kept trying to reshape it into anything else, a bundle of hide, a pack, anything other than what it plainly was, and it was not until I reached out with a shaking hand and touched the small shoulder and felt how cold it already was, colder than the body beside it, colder than anything alive has a right to be, that the whole shape of what I had walked into finally landed on me. It was already dead. It had been dead, I would come to understand over the following hours, for some time before I ever fired that shot, its small body already gone still and stiff, which told me clearly it had passed hours earlier, not minutes. And the larger one, the one I had just killed on the ice of a frozen pond in the last hard light of a Maine January evening, had not been crouched over my trap out of aggression or threat at all. It had been carrying its dead child through the timber, the way a grieving parent carries what they cannot yet set down. And the trap it triggered was simple accident, a misstep in the dark by a creature whose mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere I now understood with a clarity that has never once left me in the 60 years since. The wind had picked up by then, coming down cold off the ridge and pushing loose snow in thin streams across the ice, and I remember how the cold worked its way through my wool coat while I knelt there, how my knees went numb against the ice and I did not care, how somewhere behind me in the timber a raven called once, twice, and then went silent, as if even the birds understood that whatever was happening on that pond needed to happen without an audience. The pond itself, Musquacook, sat maybe 400 yards across at its widest point, ringed by black spruce and the bare gray trunks of paper birch, and in any other January that stretch of shoreline would have been the most peaceful place I knew. That night it felt like the loneliest place on earth. I knelt on that ice between the two of them, the mother I had just shot and the child she had already lost, and something in my chest broke open that has never fully closed since. I want to tell you what I did next and what I found written in the snow beyond them that made the whole night worse still. But that part of the story belongs to what came after, because I sat on that ice for a long time before I could make myself move again. And when I finally did move, what I found changed the rest of my life. What I found beyond the two of them, once I had gathered enough of myself to stand and look, was a trail leading back along the route they had come, out across the pond and into the timber on the far shore, and it told a story I have never been able to set down since without my hands shaking. The small one's tracks stopped a good 300 yards back in the trees at the base of a blown-down spruce where the snow was packed and disturbed in a wide circle, the kind of disturbance that comes from a body settling and struggling and going still over a period of hours, not minutes. From that spot, only the larger set of tracks continued on, deeper, closer together, weighted down on one side, which told me plainly she had been carrying something in that arm from that point forward. She had walked 300 yards through failing light and dropping temperature with her child already gone, and she had been carrying it toward my side of the pond when the trap took her foot, and I took the rest. There was a third set of tracks, too, off to the side, smaller than hers, but larger than the child's, that came in from the north, paused at the edge of that disturbed circle in the snow, and then retreated along the same route back into the deep timber without ever closing the distance. I have thought about that third track line more than almost anything else from that night. I believe now, and I believed it within days of standing over that scene, that it belonged to another adult, and that whatever passed between them at that blown-down spruce, whatever decision was made in a language I will never understand, it left her to carry her child alone the rest of the way while the other one went for help or went to grieve somewhere private or simply could not bear to stay. I do not know. I will never know. But I have carried that third track line with me for 60 years the same way I have carried the two bodies on the ice. I did not report what happened that night. I want to be honest about why, because it would be easy for me to tell you I stayed silent out of some noble instinct to protect a species science had not yet acknowledged. And there is truth in that, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was 30 years old with a pregnant wife waiting for me in Fort Kent, and I had just killed something that no game warden, no biologist, and no judge in the state of Maine would have known what to do with, and every possible outcome of reporting it terrified me. I did not know if killing it was a crime. I did not know if it would be treated as evidence, studied, or simply dismissed as the ravings of a trapper who had spent too many weeks alone in the cold. I only knew that I could not leave those two bodies on open pond ice for the ravens and the coyotes to find, and I could not walk away and pretend the last 4 hours of my life had not happened. I want to tell you, too, about the moment just before I began digging, because I have described the digging itself, but not the pause that came before it. I knelt there for a long while after finding the child's body, simply looking at the two of them together, and I remember reaching out hesitantly and resting my bare hand against the mother's shoulder for a moment, the way a person might rest a hand on the shoulder of someone they had wronged, seeking some kind of permission I had no right to seek and no way of actually receiving. Her hair beneath my palm was coarse but not unpleasant, dense with a kind of insulating thickness I had felt before only on the winter coat of a healthy moose, and beneath that hair, even through the cooling of death, I could still feel the shape of powerful muscle across her shoulder, the physical evidence of something built for enormous strength who had, as far as every scrap of evidence I ever gathered about her kind would suggest, spent that strength almost entirely in service of gathering, carrying, and protecting, rather than in any violence toward my own kind. I have wondered across 60 years whether that moment of resting my hand on her shoulder was the actual beginning of everything that followed, more than the shot itself, or even the burial. It was the first moment I treated her as someone rather than something, and I believe now that everything I did in the decades afterward, the quiet stewardship, the refusal to trap that ground again, the friendship with Delphis built around protecting what remained of her kind, all of it grew out of that single small gesture of a hand on a shoulder in the last hard light of a January evening, offered far too late to matter to her, but not, I have come to believe, too late to matter to who I became afterward. I worked through the night. I do not fully remember the labor of it now, only fragments, the frozen ground fighting my hand axe along the tree line above the pond where the soil was a little softer under a stand of old cedar, the ache building in my shoulders that had nothing to do with cold, the way my breath kept catching in something that was not quite crying and not quite anything else I had a name for. I dug what grave I could manage in ground that fought me at every foot, and by the gray hour before dawn I had laid them both to rest together, the mother and the child she had never stopped carrying, under a low cairn of stone I built by hand, because I did not trust the ground alone to hold against spring thaw and scavenging animals. I marked the spot in my head with 3 landmarks: a lightning-scarred cedar, a boulder split clean down the middle by some old frost heave, and the angle of the pond's outlet stream, because I knew even that night, half out of my mind with grief and cold, that I would need to find that place again. I remember, at one point during that digging, stopping to rest my shoulders and looking up at a sky gone hard and clear and thick with more stars than I had any names for, and thinking, though it embarrasses me even now to admit it, that I owed whoever might still be listening in that timber some kind of accounting, some proof that what I was doing was not an attempt to hide a crime, but an attempt, however late and however small, to treat the dead as I would have wanted my own family treated. I said her name out loud once while I worked, though I did not have a name to give her, so what came out instead was simply, "I am sorry," spoken to the frozen ground and the two shapes I was laying into it, and I do not know if anything heard me, but I have never once regretted saying it. I got back to the Musquacook cabin sometime after 7 in the morning, having walked the last 2 miles in full daylight with my rifle slung and unused, and my hands so cold I could barely work the door latch. I built up the stove and I sat at the small table where I kept my logbook, and I wrote down everything I could remember while it was still fresh, the tracks, the calls I had heard 2 nights before, the shot, the two bodies, the third trail that retreated into the timber. I want you to understand that I was not thinking even then about someday telling this story to strangers. I was thinking that if I did not write it down, some part of my mind would try to convince me later that none of it had happened, and I did not want to give that part of my mind the satisfaction. I have thought many times since about what my father would have said if I had told him that spring instead of waiting decades. He was still trapping his own smaller line near Fort Kent in 1966, semi-retired, but not yet willing to give up the woods entirely, and he had a steadiness about him that I badly needed in those first weeks and never once asked for. I have wondered whether his silence about 1939 was its own kind of grief, carried the same way I would come to carry mine, and whether 2 generations of Michaud men might have found some comfort in finally speaking to each other about it had I found the courage sooner. I did not find that courage until he was already gone, and that is a regret that sits alongside the shooting itself, quieter but just as permanent. The following week was the hardest of my life up to that point, and I include in that comparison the death of my own father years later and the loss we suffered with our second child in 1971, because at least those griefs had somewhere to go, a funeral, a community, a name spoken out loud among people who understood the shape of the loss. What I carried out of that January was mine alone, and it had nowhere to go, and it sat in my chest like a stone I could not set down, no matter how far I walked. I finished my circuit of the line that season on autopilot, checking traps I no longer had any heart for, catching beaver and marten with hands that did the work, while the rest of me stayed back at that cairn of stone above Musquacook Pond. I did not go near that stretch of shoreline again for the remainder of the season. I pulled every trap within a half-mile of it and never reset them, telling myself and later telling the land agent in Millinocket that the area had gone unproductive, which was not entirely a lie because I never once checked to find out. I kept trapping for a good many years after 1966, right through until 1992, when my knees finally told me plainly that I was done with snowshoes and cold cabins for good. Those 26 seasons were not simply years I endured while waiting for the story to eventually be told. They were a full working life, and I want to give you some sense of what that life looked like beyond the one winter this story centers on, because a man is not only the worst night of his life, however much that night shapes him. Beaver pelts brought good money through most of the 70s, and I built a modest but comfortable living off that line, enough to help Yvette and me put a down payment on our own house in Fort Kent in 1969, rather than continue renting from her uncle, enough to send Denise to nursing school without the debt some of her classmates carried. I trapped otter and fisher alongside the beaver, and in the later years, I added a small run of coyote sets. As that population expanded into the state, coyotes having pushed east from the Midwest over the course of the 70s and 80s until they were common across most of northern Maine by the time I hung up my own traps for good. I made it back to Fort Kent in late March, when the season closed, thinner than Yvette had ever seen me, and quieter than she had any patience for. She asked me the first night I was home, sitting across from me at our kitchen table with her hand resting on a belly that had grown considerably in the 3 months I had been gone, what had happened out there, because she said I did not walk into that house the same man who had walked out of it in November. I did not tell her. Not that night, not for years afterward, though. I will tell you before this story is finished that I did eventually tell her everything, and what she said to me when I finally did changed the direction of the rest of my life every bit as much as that night on the ice had. For now, I want to leave you where I was left, sitting in a cold cabin the morning after, staring at a logbook with the words, "Not a bear," written in my own unsteady hand, carrying a grief I had no right to and no way to explain, and hearing, faint and distant on the wind that came down off the ridge behind Musquacook Pond, 2 nights later, while I finished out my circuit alone, one more of those low carrying calls, carrying across miles of frozen forest, searching as far as I could ever tell for someone who was never coming home. I carried that secret alone for 6 years before I told Yvette the truth of it, and I carried it another 38 years after that before I told anyone else outside my own family. What happened in between and how that single night reshaped how I hunted, how I trapped, and eventually how I spent the back half of my working life is a harder story to tell than the shooting itself, because grief like that does not arrive once and pass. It asks something different of me every year for the rest of my life. I want to tell you about the months immediately following that January, because I skipped past a good deal of what those first weeks actually looked like, and I think the texture of that time matters. I finished the remainder of my circuit that season, as I told you, running the line on something close to autopilot, and I want to describe one particular stop along that route that I have never mentioned before, because it came closest in those early weeks to breaking my resolve to stay silent. There was an old family friend, a man named Aurel Beaulieu, who ran a small general store in Eagle Lake and who had known my father for over 30 years, and who I stopped to see on my supply run that February on my way back to the deeper stretches of the line. Aurel was a man people talked to, the kind of storekeeper who heard half the county's business over his counter whether he wanted to or not, and he had a way of asking a question that made a person feel there was no wrong answer available. He looked at me across that counter, weighing out traps and cartridges for my resupply, and he asked plainly whether something had happened out on the line that winter, because I did not look like a man who had simply had a hard season. I stood there with a box of shells in my hand and felt the whole story rise up in my chest, ready to spill out onto that counter between the canned goods and the trap catalogs, and I came closer in that moment than at any other point in the following 6 years to telling someone everything. What stopped me in the end was not any calculated decision, but a simple, almost physical inability to find the first sentence. The same way a person sometimes cannot make themselves step off a high ledge into water, no matter how many times they have done it before. I told Aurela I had lost more sets than usual to a bear that had given me trouble all season, which was not entirely a lie, and he nodded, satisfied. And we talked instead about the price of muskrat pelts that year, and I drove out of Eagle Lake with the whole truth still sitting exactly where it had been sitting since that night on the ice, unspoken and unshared. Denise's birth that June brought its own strange echo of that January, though I did not fully understand it as an echo until years later. Yvette's labor was long, close to 18 hours at the small hospital in Fort Kent, and I remember pacing a waiting room corridor with a nervousness that felt, in a way I could not have articulated to anyone at the time, disproportionate to an ordinary birth, as if some part of me was braced for the same kind of catastrophe I had witnessed on that ice 5 months earlier. When the nurse finally came out to tell me Denise had arrived healthy, with a full head of dark hair and a cry loud enough to be heard down the hall, I remember sitting down hard in one of those waiting room chairs and putting my face in my hands, and the nurse thinking I was simply overcome with ordinary new father emotion, patted my shoulder, and told me it was always like this for the good ones. She had no way of knowing what else was mixed into those tears, the grief of that January folding itself unexpectedly into the relief and joy of that June, two things that had no business sitting so close together in one man's chest. But that sat there anyway, for years, whenever I let myself think too long about either one. Yvette gave birth to our daughter Denise in June of 1966, 5 months after that night on the pond, and I remember holding her for the first time in the hospital in Fort Kent and thinking about the small shape curled against its mother's side in the snow. I had to leave the room for a few minutes because I could not hold both of those things in my chest at the same time without coming apart. Yvette noticed she noticed most things about me in those years that I thought I was hiding well, and by the time Denise was 5 in the fall of 1971, my wife sat me down at that same kitchen table where she had first asked me what happened, and she told me she was done waiting for me to decide. I trusted her enough to say it, so I told her. All of it, the tracks, the calls, answering each other across the pond, the shot, the two bodies, the burial, the third set of tracks that turned back into the timber. She listened without a single word of interruption, which was not like her, because Yvette Michaud was not a woman who let much of anything pass without comment. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she reached across the table and took my hand, and she said something I have held on to every day since. She said, "Wilfred, you did not murder a monster. You made a terrible mistake in the dark, and you have been punishing yourself for it every season since, and that is not honoring what happened. That is just adding more grief to grief." She said the kindest thing I could do now for myself and for whatever else might still be living in those woods was to stop hiding from it and start protecting it instead. I want to tell you what her face did while I talked because I have never forgotten it, and I think it matters to understanding who she was. She did not flinch at the shot itself, and she did not flinch at the two bodies, but her composure broke, just slightly, just at the corner of her mouth, when I told her about the third set of tracks turning back into the timber. She asked me quietly whether I thought that third one had been the child's father or an aunt or an older sibling, someone who could not bear to watch. I told her I had turned that same question over more times than I could count and had never landed on an answer that satisfied me. She nodded and she did not push further, but I could see she was carrying that question forward with her from that evening on, the same way I had been carrying it alone for 6 years. I did not know in 1971 exactly what protecting it would come to mean. I found out slowly over the better part of 2 decades, and it started with something small. I stopped trapping the Musquacook stretch of the line entirely, not just the half-mile around the burial site, but the whole chain of 3 ponds, close to 4 miles of prime beaver and otter country that I simply walked away from and never worked again. My father, before he passed in 1974, asked me more than once why I had given up ground that productive, and I told him only that I had my reasons, and he looked at me the look a man gives another man when he suspects there is a story he is not being told, and he never pushed. I have wondered since whether he understood more than he let on, given the story he told me once as a boy and never repeated. He died without either of us ever raising the subject again, and that silence between us is one of the few regrets from those years that has nothing to do with a rifle or a trapline at all. I think if I could have one more evening at that kitchen table with him, I would spend it telling him everything, and I believe now he would have listened without much surprise at all, the same steady way he listened to most things in his life. I want to say more about how Delphis and I built that trust because it did not happen in a single conversation, and I do not want to give the impression that two men simply decided one afternoon to become the quiet guardians of a hidden population. It took years. Delphis was, in those early seasons, a careful and somewhat guarded young man. the kind who had grown up on a dairy farm outside Van Buren and learned early not to say more than a situation required. Our friendship built itself the ordinary way friendships build in that country, over shared work, splitting firewood at the Musquacook cabin during a patrol that ran long, comparing notes on ice conditions, trading small favors with tools and truck parts. It was not until the winter of 1972, better than 3 years after his first question to me in that supply store, that he brought the subject up again, this time at my own kitchen table with Yvette pouring coffee for both of us, and asked me plainly whether I would help him learn that country as it actually needed to be learned rather than as the department's maps taught it. The land agent in Millinocket eventually reassigned that stretch to another trapper, a younger man named Delphis Ouellette, who would go on some years later to become a Maine game warden himself. I want to tell you about Delphis because he becomes important to the rest of this story, and because he is one of only two people outside my immediate family who ever came to know the full truth of what happened out there. Delphis worked that stretch of the Allagash country for parts of 3 seasons in the late 1960s, and by the winter of 1969, he came to me at a trapper's supply store in Fort Kent and asked me in a low voice whether I had ever run into anything strange working the Musquacook ponds. I asked him what he meant by strange. He described tracks close to what I had seen and a night he had spent in one of the old line cabins listening to calls that answered each other across the water the same way I had heard them. I told him that day in the store the same lie I had told everyone else for 3 years, that I did not know what he was talking about. But my face must have given me away, because Delphis looked at me for a long moment and said only that he had decided to stop working that stretch too, and that some ground in his opinion was better left to whatever already had a claim on it. Delphis and I became close friends over the following years, closer than I had expected given how our conversation started, and in 1973, when he took the warden's exam and was assigned to patrol the northern Allagash district, he came to me privately and asked if I would help him understand the country better than the department's maps could tell him. What I did not tell him outright, but what I believe he came to understand on his own over time, was that part of what I was teaching him, alongside beaver sign and moose wintering yards and the safest river crossings, was where not to send hunting parties, where not to approve new logging access roads, and which stretches of that forest a man in his position could quietly steer people away from without ever having to explain why. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you that Delphis Ouellette and I ran some kind of organized effort to hide a species from the state of Maine. What we did was smaller and I think more honest than that. We simply paid attention to a piece of ground that had already taught both of us to be careful with it, and over the better part of 2 decades, we quietly discouraged the kind of traffic that would have brought outside attention to it. When International Paper proposed a new logging road in 1978 that would have cut directly through the Musquacook drainage, Delphis flagged concerns about a nesting pair of bald eagles he had documented nearby, which was true. There were eagles there, and the road got rerouted 2 miles to the east. When a group of hunters from Massachusetts wanted a guide into that same stretch of country in the fall of 1981, I told them, truthfully as far as the deer numbers went, that the hunting had been poor there for years and steered them to a different drainage entirely. None of this undid what I had done in January of 1966. I want to be clear about that, because I do not want you to walk away from this story thinking I found some clean redemption that balanced the scales. What it did was give me a way to carry it that did not simply flatten me, and it gave whatever else might still be living in those woods 40 more years of quiet ground than they might otherwise have had. I went back to the burial site exactly once in those early years, in the summer of 1980, 14 years after that January night, because Yvette convinced me I needed to see it in daylight, in a season without snow and cold pressing down on every memory before I could truly set any of it down. We hiked in together on a warm July morning, following the same three landmarks I had fixed in my mind that first terrible night: the lightning-scarred cedar, the split boulder, the angle of the outlet stream, and we found the cairn still standing, undisturbed, moss beginning to soften its edges, as moss does in that country within a decade or two on anything left alone. We stood there for a long while without talking. Then Yvette knelt down in the moss beside that cairn and said a small prayer in French, taught to her by her own grandmother, and I stood over her with my hat off and my throat too tight to add anything of my own. When we walked out of those woods that afternoon, I felt, for the first time in 14 years, like I could breathe all the way down into my chest without something catching halfway. I want to tell you about the second time I encountered one of them, because it happened only once more in my life, and it happened under circumstances different enough from that first terrible night that it gave me something I badly needed, which was proof that what I had done had not driven every one of them out of that country for good, and proof, more importantly, that they were not the vengeful things a guilty man's imagination could easily conjure in the years after a mistake like mine. It was October of 1989. I was 53 years old by then, mostly retired from active trapping, though I still kept a small line for beaver near Fort Kent to supplement my pension from the years I had spent later in life working seasonal maintenance for the paper company. Delphis, who by then had been a warden for 16 years, asked me to come along on a routine patrol up the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, checking a handful of backcountry campsites for storm damage after a hard September blow had taken down a lot of timber. We were nowhere near the Musquacook ponds that day, a good 11 miles east along the main stem of the river, and I want that distance to register, because it told me something important about how far that population's range might actually extend. We were checking a campsite near Round Pond in the early afternoon when Delphis, ahead of me on the trail, stopped dead, every instinct in his body firing at once, one closed fist raised. I came up beside him, slow and quiet, and there, across a narrow finger of the pond, maybe 60 yards off, stood a single adult, upright, still, watching us with an attention that felt calm and purposeful rather than startled. It was smaller than the one I had shot 23 years earlier, or perhaps simply appeared smaller at that distance, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, standing at the edge of a stand of young poplar that had grown in thick since the last time that ground had been logged. We did not move. It did not move. For the better part of a full minute, the three of us stood in that strange, suspended stillness that anyone who has ever locked eyes with something wild and intelligent across open water will understand. And then slowly it lifted one arm, not in threat, not in any gesture I could read as aggression, but in something closer to acknowledgment, the way a neighbor might raise a hand across a field without breaking stride. Then it turned unhurried and walked back into the poplar stand and was gone. I want to describe that 60 yards of open water a little more, because I have replayed it so many times over the following decades that I can still call up details I did not think I was registering at the time. The pond surface was flat, calm, no wind that afternoon, and the reflection of that stand of young poplar broke apart in slow ripples every time the figure shifted its weight, which it did only twice in that full minute, small adjustments, nothing hurried. I remember the smell reaching us even across that distance, faint but immediately recognizable to me after everything I had learned 23 years earlier, that same musky, earthen weight in the air. Delphis, who had never smelled it before that day, asked me afterward what it reminded him of, and I told him it reminded me of wet hair on a dog crossed with the smell of a root cellar in late winter, which is the closest I have ever come to putting words to it. Delphis did not say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, "Quiet, you knew that was coming, didn't you?" I told him I hadn't known for certain, but I had hoped. He asked me if I thought it was the same population from the Musquacook country. I told him I believed it was, based on the distance and the terrain, that 11 miles of connected forest with no roads. Through it was nothing to a creature built the way that one was built. He nodded, and neither of us said much else about it that day, but I remember the drive back to Fort Kent that evening, and I remember feeling, for the first time since 1966, something closer to peace than to grief when I thought about those woods. Yvette was waiting up when I got home that night from Round Pond, just as she always waited up whenever I went out with Delphis, and she took one look at my face across the kitchen and knew right away that something had happened before I said a word. When I told her, she did not say much. At first, she just held both of my hands across that same table where she had once told me I had not murdered a monster, and after a while she said that she believed the forest had finally decided to show me it was still there, still whole, still carrying on, and that maybe that was as close to forgiveness as either of us was ever going to get, and that we ought to accept it as the gift it was, rather than keep waiting for something larger. I want to say a little more about what those years with Delphis taught me before I move forward, because I think it matters to understanding everything that followed. We built across that decade a kind of shorthand between us, a look across a room at a public meeting when a topic was drifting somewhere. It should not drift. A phone call that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer, an understanding that neither of us would ever put certain things in writing where a records request might someday surface them. I have never had a friendship quite like it before or since, built almost entirely around a shared silence rather than shared conversation, and I do not know that I fully appreciated while Delphis was alive how rare and how valuable that kind of silence between two men actually was. I want to stop the story here for a moment and ask you something, because I think it matters more than most of what I could tell you next. If you had been the one kneeling on that ice in 1966, having just made the same mistake I made, what would you have done differently? And do you think you could have carried it for as long as I carried it without telling a single soul? I ask because I still do not know the answer for myself, even now, even after 81 years. I have not encountered one of them face to face since that afternoon at Round Pond, though I want to tell you about a handful of things that happened over the following 3 decades that I believe were not accidents, and that I have come to understand in my old age as a kind of ongoing conversation, if you can call it that, between myself and whatever remains of that family or clan up along the Musquacook chain. In the fall of 1994, 28 years after that January night, I hiked back into the burial site alone, an act Yvette worried about given that I was 58 and my knees had already started giving me trouble on rough ground. I brought nothing with me but a small folding knife and the intention of clearing back some of the brush that had grown up around the cairn. When I arrived, the cairn was undisturbed, but laid across the top of it, placed there on purpose rather than fallen from any tree above, was a single piece of cedar bark, curled and weathered but clearly shaped by hand, worked into a rough, simple form that I can only describe as resembling two figures standing close together, one taller, one small. I sat with that piece of bark for a long time before I brought it home, and it sits now in a small wooden box in my desk drawer alongside my old Trapline logbook, and I have never been able to explain it any other way than as an acknowledgment from someone or something that understood exactly what that cairn marked and exactly who had built it. The cedar bark was not the only object left for me at that cairn over the years, though it was the one that struck me hardest. In the summer of 2001, 35 years after that January, I hiked in for one of my periodic visits and found, resting against the base of the cairn where the moss had grown thickest, a small bundle of dried plants tied with a strip of inner bark similar in construction to items I would later read about in accounts from other parts of the country describing offerings left by these same beings for people they had come to trust. I did not recognize all of the plants in that bundle, though a few, when I described them later to Michelle without telling her where they had come from, she identified as having traditional uses for pain relief and wound care among practices she had studied during her own coursework. I have wondered since whether that bundle was left as a kind of gift, the same impulse toward reciprocity that seems to run through every account I have ever read of long-term contact with these beings, or whether it carried a more specific meaning I will never be equipped to understand. In the fall of 2008, I found a third object, smaller than the first two, a single stone, smooth and dark, with what looked like a carefully worked groove running along one face, the kind of wear pattern a stone takes on after long handling rather than natural weathering. I brought that stone home as well, and it sits now in the same small wooden box as the cedar bark, alongside Yvette's rosary and my old logbook, four objects that together tell a story no museum would ever be equipped to display, and no scientist would likely be permitted to study, given everything Delphis and I spent our careers doing to keep that population beyond the reach of exactly that kind of attention. I have thought a great deal over the decades about what those three objects might mean taken together, spaced out as they were across nearly 35 years, each one arriving at a moment when I had made the long hike back into that particular stretch of timber. I do not believe they were random. I believe, though I cannot prove it and would not know how to begin trying, that whatever remains of that population up along the Musquacook chain has continued across generations of its own to recognize that cairn for what it marks and to recognize me, or whatever I represent to them by now, an old man who comes back every few years and disturbs nothing and asks for nothing and simply stands there for a while before leaving again. I do not know what word in whatever language passes between them would describe a relationship like that. I only know it has felt across 60 years less like haunting and more like a kind of long, slow correspondence conducted almost entirely in silence. I turned that piece of bark over in my hands for a long time before I understood what I was looking at, sitting right there in the snow beside the cairn, with my breath fogging in front of me the same way it had fogged that first terrible night, 28 years earlier. The two figures were worked in shallow relief, the bark shaved away in careful strokes rather than gouged, patient work, the kind that takes a steady hand and no particular hurry. I have shown it to exactly two people since, Yvette and Denise, and both of them, on seeing it, went quiet. And that quiet told me they understood, without my having to explain what it meant, that somewhere in that timber something had not only found the cairn, but had recognized it for what it was, and had chosen, in its own language, to answer it. Denise, our daughter, grew up knowing only that her father carried a private grief connected to his years trapping the Allagash country, because Yvette and I made the decision when she was young not to burden her with the full weight of it until she was old enough to carry that kind of knowledge responsibly. I told her the whole story in 2003 when she was 37, sitting in her own kitchen in Presque Isle with her husband and my two grandchildren asleep down the hall, and I watched her face go through the same disbelief, the same struggle to reconcile the father she knew with the story I was telling that I imagine you may be going through right now. When I finished, she asked me only one question. She asked whether I thought the third one, the one whose tracks had turned back into the timber that first night without ever closing the distance, was still out there somewhere. I told her I believed it was. I told her I believed, based on everything I had pieced together over close to 40 years by that point, that whatever forgiveness or understanding exists in a family that has lost what that one lost, it does not arrive quickly, and it does not arrive the same way it might for us. But I believed, and I still believe today, that it had arrived somewhere in those decades of quiet ground and undisturbed cairns and small worked pieces of cedar bark left where only I would find them. Denise asked me more that night than just about the third set of tracks. She asked whether I had ever thought about what that child might have grown into had things gone differently, and I told her honestly that I had more times than I could count, usually in the quiet hour before sleep when a mind wanders to places it has no business wandering. She asked if I felt I owed anything to the larger one I had killed, beyond the burial and beyond the decades of quiet stewardship, and I told her that I did not think a debt like that could ever be paid off completely, only carried well or carried poorly, and that I had spent my life trying to carry it well. She reached across her own kitchen table then, much as her mother once had across ours, and told me she was proud of how I had carried it, which was not a thing I had expected to hear and not a thing I have ever forgotten. Delphis had a full career beyond what he did for me, and I think it is worth telling a little of it because he was a good warden by any measure, not just a quiet keeper of one family's secret. He worked search and rescue operations up and down the Allagash corridor for over 2 decades, and he was part of the team that recovered 2 lost hunters west of Round Pond in the winter of 1976, a rescue that made the Bangor paper at the time, though his own name barely appeared in the coverage because that was how he preferred it. He trained younger wardens for the better part of his last decade on the job, and I met several of them over the years at gatherings Delphis hosted at his own camp on Eagle Lake. Good men who respected him without ever quite understanding, I believe, the particular weight he carried on my behalf for so many years. He married a woman named Teresa in 1975, a school teacher from Van Buren, and they had 2 sons, neither of whom, as far as I know, was ever told the full truth about what their father spent so much quiet energy protecting. Delphis told me once, not long before he retired, that he had considered telling his older boy, who had shown some interest in wildlife biology himself, but that he had decided against it in the end, believing the knowledge was safer carried by fewer people rather than more, even within a family he trusted completely. He passed in the spring of 2018 of complications from a heart condition that had been managed for close to a decade before it finally caught up with him. I was at his funeral in Fort Kent along with Yvette, who was already beginning to show the early signs of the illness that would take her the following year, though neither of us knew that yet. I stood at the back of that church and thought about the 2 of us decades earlier, standing on opposite sides of a supply store counter while he asked me a careful question and I gave him a careful answer, and how much had grown out of that single guarded exchange. I did not speak at his funeral because I did not trust myself to say what I actually wanted to say without saying too much, but I visited his grave alone the following week and told him out loud, the way I had once told the forest itself, that I was sorry and that I was grateful, and that both of those things had been true for over 50 years. Delphis retired from the Maine warden service in 1997 after 24 years. Before he died, he told me he had made a point throughout his career of quietly documenting every reported anomalous track or sighting that came into his district office, not for any official file, but for a private record he kept in a shoebox in his own closet, and he told me the pattern in that shoebox, spanning better than 2 decades of his career, showed a population that had persisted in that stretch of the Allagash country the entire time, moving, adapting, staying just far enough ahead of the logging roads and the recreational traffic to remain what it had always been to the handful of people who knew where to look and knew not to say anything about it. Delphis showed me that shoebox once in the winter of 2012, 5 years before he retired for good from any kind of field work. It held close to 40 index cards, each one dated and initialed, recording a track measurement, a strange call reported by a canoe party, a food cache disturbed in a way no known animal could account for, spread out across better than 2 decades in a district that covered close to 400 square miles of the northern Allagash. He told me he had never once filed a formal report on any of it, because a formal report would have triggered a wildlife biologist's visit, and a biologist's visit would have triggered a survey team. And a survey team, sooner or later, would have found exactly what we had spent our whole careers trying to keep quiet. He said the cards were not for the department, they were for himself, so that when he was an old man looking back on his career, he would have some proof, even if only to himself, that the choice he made every single day not to look too hard in one particular direction had been the right one. One card in that shoebox stayed with me longer than the others, and Delphis let me read it myself rather than just describe it. It was dated August of 1983, and it recorded an account from a family of canoeists out of Massachusetts who had put in at Churchill Depot and paddled down through the Maine stem past the Musquacook tributaries. They reported to a ranger at one of the public campsites that on their second night out, they had watched something cross the river at dusk, roughly a quarter-mile upstream from their camp, moving with a long, even stride through water that came up past its knees, and that it had paused mid-river for several seconds, looking in their direction before continuing to the far bank and disappearing into the timber without ever hurrying. The father in that party had sketched a rough outline in his trip journal, which the ranger copied before handing the original back, and Delphis had traced that sketch onto his own index card. It was not detailed, just a dark, tall silhouette against a lighter background of sky, but the proportions matched, close enough that my hands were not entirely steady holding that card either. I want to take a moment here to talk about how this fits with what little the wider world already knows, because I do not want you to think I am asking you to believe something without any context at all. Maine's Northwoods and the Allagash region in particular have carried a long history of reported sightings and unexplained tracks going back well over a century, most of them dismissed, some of them never even reported because the people who saw something understood, as I came to understand, that speaking up would cost them more than staying quiet ever would. I am not the first person to have walked out of that forest carrying a secret too large to set down. I do not expect I will be the last. I have had a lot of years now to sit with what it means to have taken a mother from her child, or rather what remained of a child once the mother was already carrying it toward whatever peace she intended to give it. I raised my own daughter and later helped raise two grandchildren, and I know something of what it costs a parent to lose a child, because Yvette and I buried our own second baby in 1971, a boy we had already named Marcel, born 4 weeks early and gone within 2 days despite everything the hospital in Presque Isle could do. I do not equate the two losses because I do not think grief works by equivalence, but I will tell you that carrying our own Marcel to that small grave in the Fort Kent cemetery taught me something about the particular weight of laying a child into frozen ground that I had not fully understood the night I built that cairn above Musquacook Pond 5 years earlier. It taught me that a parent does not stop being a parent because the world has taken the child away, and that the small acts of care that follow, the marking of a grave, the return visits, the objects left behind, are not separate from parenthood, but a continuation of it, carried out in the only form still available. I have had the same dream in one form or another, perhaps a dozen times, across the 60 years since that January. And I want to describe it here because I think it says something about how deeply that night settled into whatever part of a person carries things too large for ordinary memory. In the dream, I am back on that ice, but the light is different, warmer, more like late afternoon in October than the failing blue dusk of a January evening, and the mother is not lying on the ice at all, but standing whole, unharmed, with the child held against her shoulder as any mother holds a sleeping child. She does not look at me with anger. She looks at me the way I imagine a person might look at a stranger who has wandered uninvited into a private moment of grief, some mixture of surprise and forbearance, And in the dream, I always try to speak, to apologize, to explain myself, and I never manage to get a single word out before I wake. I told Yvette about that dream only once, early in our marriage after I had finally told her the full truth, and she said something I have carried alongside everything else she ever told me. She said, perhaps the dream was not asking me to apologize at all, but simply asking me to see, one more time, what I had not been able to see clearly enough in the failing light of that actual evening that the being on the ice had been, in every way that mattered, exactly what any mother anywhere would be, whole and worthy of the same grief and the same dignity my own kind reserves for its own losses. I have tried in the years since to let the dream serve that purpose rather than the purpose of punishment I originally assigned it, though I will tell you honestly that some nights it still feels like punishment regardless of how I try to reframe it in the daylight hours. I want to return to that thread about Joseph Nicola and the Passamaquoddy accounts my father passed along secondhand, because I have thought about it more in recent years than I did for most of my life, and I think it deserves a fuller telling. Michelle, during one of her visits home a few years back, mentioned in passing that some of her colleagues at the state wildlife department had, informally and mostly as a curiosity rather than a serious research interest, begun compiling references to similar beings across various Wabanaki oral traditions, figures described across generations as tall, hair-covered, elusive, and generally uninterested in conflict with people, so long as people extended the same courtesy in return. I did not tell her why the subject interested me so much more than she would have expected from an old retired trapper, but I listened closely, and what she described matched, in its broad shape, everything Joseph Nicola had apparently told my father decades before either Michelle or I were born. I have come to believe that the people who lived on this land the longest understood something about it that the rest of us, arriving later with our surveys and our property lines and our paper company leases, were slower to learn, and in my case, learned only at a terrible cost. I want to say more, too, about that third set of tracks, the one that paused at the edge of the disturbed snow where the child had died and then retreated without ever closing the distance, because I have turned that image over in my mind more than almost any other single detail from that night. And I think, after 60 years, I finally have something closer to a settled understanding of what I believe it meant. I do not think that third individual failed the mother and child out of indifference. I believe, based on everything else I came to understand about how that population conducts itself, its patience, its restraint, its evident capacity for grief, that whatever passed between them in that moment was a decision made quickly and under enormous strain about how best to respond to a crisis neither of them could have anticipated. Perhaps the third one went for help that never arrived in time. Perhaps the third one recognized, as any experienced parent or elder recognizes, that some griefs cannot be shared in the moment, only witnessed and then carried separately until there is room to grieve together. I will never know which of these was closer to the truth, if either was, but I have made a kind of peace with not knowing, the same peace I have made with so much else from that night. Some winters I still catch myself walking out to check the mail in the first hard cold of December, standing still for a moment and listening as I used to listen on the line, out of habit more than expectation now. Nothing answers. It has been a long time since anything needed to. I should tell you more about Denise's own life, because she grew into a woman every bit as capable as her mother, and the story of our family does not stop with what happened on that pond in 1966. She studied nursing at the University of Maine in Presque Isle, graduating in 1987, and she spent close to 30 years working the maternity ward at a regional hospital there, a career I have always believed suited her instincts perfectly, since she inherited her mother's particular gift for steadying frightened people without making a show of the steadying. She married a man named Robert Ouellette in 1990, no relation to Delphis as far as either family ever traced, a school teacher himself who taught history at the local high school for over 3 decades. They had two children, Mark, born in 1992, and a daughter, Michelle, born in 1995, who studied wildlife biology and now works for the state of Maine, and who still asks every visit home whether her grandfather will finally take her up to see that pond he is always so protective of, a question I have deflected for longer than I probably should have. Mark followed a different path than his sister, studying forestry at the University of Maine and going to work eventually for a private timber management company that holds land not far from the old paper company ground I once trapped. He married a woman named Caitlin in 2017, and their daughter, the great-granddaughter I mentioned earlier, was born in 2015, before the marriage even, which is its own small story I will not get into here except to say that Mark has always struck me as a young man who does things in whatever order feels right to him rather than the order the world expects, a trait I recognize with some amusement as very much a Michaud trait. I want to go back now and tell you more fully about the last years of Yvette's life because I gave you only a brief accounting earlier, and I think she deserves better than that from me, even in a story that is not primarily about her. Yvette was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall of 2017 at the age of 78, caught later than either of us would have liked because she had, characteristically, downplayed her own symptoms for months rather than worry anyone. The treatment that followed surgery and then a course of chemotherapy at the Regional Cancer Center in Bangor was hard on her in ways I had never seen a hard season on the Trapline be hard on me, and I spent those months learning a kind of helplessness I had not encountered before, sitting in waiting rooms unable to do a single useful thing with my hands while my wife fought something I could not track, could not set a trap for, could not outweight through sheer stubbornness the way I had outweighted so much else in my life. She had a period of remission through most of 2018, good months where we traveled a little, visited Denise and the grandchildren more than we had in years, and I remember thinking, foolishly perhaps, that we had gotten past the worst of it. The cancer returned in the spring of 2019, more aggressive the second time, and the doctors were honest with us in a way I have always respected, telling us plainly that further treatment would buy time, but not much of it, and asking Yvette what she wanted to do with whatever time remained. She chose to come home rather than continue treatment, and we spent the last 4 months of her life together in the house we had shared for over 50 years, with hospice nurses visiting several times a week and Denise driving down from Presque Isle nearly every weekend. Yvette was lucid almost to the very end, and in the last weeks she asked me to bring her the small wooden box from my desk drawer, the one holding my old Trapline logbook, her rosary, which she had not yet needed at that point, and the piece of worked cedar bark. She held that piece of bark in her lap for a long while one afternoon in August, turning it over just as I once had, and she told me that of everything in our life together, the story of that January had taught her more about the kind of man she had married than anything else I had ever done or said, and that she wanted me to promise her before she went that I would eventually tell it out loud to someone beyond our own family. I made that promise sitting beside her bed in our front room with the September light coming through the window the way it had come through 1,000 other Septembers in that same house, and I did not know, sitting there, how many more years it would take me to finally keep it. Yvette passed on the 14th of October 2019 with Denise and me both at her bedside, and the last thing she said to either of us, spoken to me specifically, was not about the cancer or the pain or any of the ordinary things a person might say. At the end, she said, "Tell them about the mother who kept carrying her child even after there was nothing left to carry it for." I have thought about that sentence every single day since, and I believe, telling you this story now, that I am finally keeping the promise she asked of me. I want to tell you what finally pushed me to speak all of this out loud after 59 years of silence, because I think the reason matters as much as the story itself. I had a health scare of my own this past winter, a heart episode that landed me in the hospital in Presque Isle for 4 days in January, close enough to the anniversary of that night on the ice that I could not help but notice the timing. It was not a serious event in the end, a cardiac arrhythmia that the doctors managed with medication rather than anything more invasive. But lying in that hospital bed for those 4 days, an old man hooked to monitors and staring at a ceiling tile pattern I had plenty of time to memorize, I caught myself doing the arithmetic every person my age eventually does, counting the years that might reasonably remain against the years that have already passed, and the sum did not come out generous. I thought, in that hospital bed, about Yvette's request spoken so plainly in the last weeks of her life, and I understood that if I did not keep that promise soon, I might not get another clear chance to keep it at all. I thought about Delphis, gone 6 years already, and the shoebox of quiet evidence he had left behind, evidence that would mean nothing to anyone who found it, without the context only I still carried. I thought about the cairn above Musquacook Pond, which would stand or fall on its own regardless of whether anyone ever knew what it marked. And I decided, somewhere in the second night of that hospital stay, that I was done letting my own fear of what people might think stand between me and a promise I had made to my wife on her deathbed. I want to describe my life now in the present a little more fully because I think it matters to know where a story like this one lands, not just where it began. I still live in the same house in Fort Kent that Yvette and I bought in 1969, though it is far too large for one old man alone. 4 bedrooms I no longer use for anything but storing the accumulated belongings of 55 years of marriage. Denise has suggested gently and more than once that I consider a smaller place, maybe something closer to her in Presque Isle, and I have told her each time that I will think about it, though we both know I have no real intention of leaving the house where Yvette and I raised our daughter and where her rosary still sits in my desk drawer alongside everything else that matters. Mark drives up from his own place near Ashland most weekends, sometimes with his daughter, sometimes alone, and we spend those visits mostly in ordinary ways, splitting the small amount of firewood I still insist on cutting myself, despite everyone's objections, or simply sitting on the porch talking about nothing in particular, as men in this part of the world have always preferred to talk, sideways through the weather and the woods and the state of the roads, rather than straight at whatever is actually sitting underneath the conversation. I am 81 years old now, and I still keep Yvette's rosary in the same desk drawer as my old logbook and that piece of worked cedar bark and the small dark stone, because those objects, more than anything else I own, tell the whole of my story better than I ever could out loud. Denise still lives in Presque Isle. My grandchildren are grown. Michelle, a wildlife biologist, working of all things for the state of Maine, though I have never told her the reason her grandfather always seemed to know, better than her own professors, which stretches of the North Woods were worth protecting and which stretches nobody needed to worry over. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I close this out, something that happened only 3 years ago in the fall of 2022, when my grandson Mark, the one who drives me up to the trailhead now, asked if he could bring his own young daughter along for the first time, my great-granddaughter, who was 7 that fall and had grown up hearing only that great-grandpa had a special place in the woods he liked to visit. I said yes on the condition that we kept the visit short and stayed well clear of the actual cairn, which sits back off any marked trail and which I have never shown to anyone outside the small circle who already knew the full story. We hiked in part way, far enough for her to see the pond and the tree line beyond it, and she asked me, as children ask questions without any of the caution adults have learned to apply, whether anything lived way back in those trees that people did not know about. I told her that the forest keeps its own business and that the kindest thing a person can do is let it, and she seemed satisfied with that answer, as children often are satisfied with an answer that leaves the real truth intact underneath it. I do not know if I will ever tell her the whole of it. That decision, I have come to believe, belongs to Denise and to Mark, not to me. The same way the decision to finally speak all of this out loud after 59 years of silence has finally come to belong to me alone. Mark has never pushed me to say more than I'm ready to say, which is a quality I recognize now as something he inherited from his grandmother rather than from me. When his daughter asked her question about the trees that afternoon, I watched him watching me, waiting to see how I would answer. And I understood in that moment that he already suspected there was more to our family's connection to that particular pond than an old man's fondness for a quiet place. He has never asked me directly. I have come to believe that some of the people closest to me have chosen, as Delphis chose all those years ago, to leave certain ground undisturbed simply because they trust that I have my reasons, and that trust, more than any explanation I could give, is its own kind of gift. I go back to that cairn above Musquacook Pond every couple of years still, though the hike is harder on my body than it used to be, and my grandson drives me up from Presque Isle and waits at the trailhead while I make the last half mile on my own, because that part of the walk has always belonged to just me and whoever else might still be listening. I do not go there anymore out of guilt, though I will tell you honestly that some small piece of that guilt has never fully left me, and I do not expect it ever will. I go because somewhere along the way, over close to 60 years of quiet visits and small found objects and one unforgettable afternoon on the shore of Round Pond, that guilt turned into something closer to devotion, a promise kept to two lives I ended too soon out of a fear I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand and make right. If you asked me before that January night in 1966 whether I believed in anything living in those woods beyond the animals I could name and track and set a trap for, I would have told you no, plainly, the way any practical Maine trapper would have told you. I do not have that certainty anymore, and I have not had it in 60 years. What I have instead is a cairn of stone above a frozen pond, a piece of worked cedar bark in my desk drawer, a friend who kept a shoebox of quiet evidence for 24 years before he passed, and a debt I have spent my whole life trying to pay down one careful season at a time. Mark asked me once on the drive back down from that hike with his daughter whether I thought the population up along the Musquacook chain was still there, still holding on 60 years on from that January night. I told him I believed it was, based on nothing more scientific than an old man's faith built up over decades of quiet visits and small found objects, but that I also believed its future depended less on anything I had done and more on whether the world around it kept learning to leave well enough alone. He did not push me further on it, and I was grateful for that because some questions are better carried than answered. I want to tell you about a moment with Denise as a young child that I have never fully explained to her, though I suspect now that she knows the whole story, she has connected the pieces herself. She was maybe 6 years old, so this would have been around 1972, and we were driving up toward Eagle Lake on a summer afternoon when she asked me, apropos of nothing a 6-year-old usually asks about, whether there were giants living in the woods. I nearly drove off the shoulder of that road. I asked her as calmly as I could manage where she had heard such a thing, and she told me simply that she had dreamed about a tall, dark, gentle giant who lived near water and who was sad about something, and that in the dream the giant had not been scary at all, just lonely. I told her that day that sometimes dreams were just dreams, and she seemed to accept that answer as children accept most answers adults give them without much argument, and she never mentioned the dream again as far as I can recall. I have never known what to make of that moment. I do not believe in a literal transmission of memory or vision from one mind to another, and I am not a superstitious man by nature, whatever else this story might suggest about me. But I have wondered, across the years since, whether a child raised by a father, carrying that much unspoken grief, might simply absorb something of it without either of us ever speaking a word, much as a house absorbs the smell of wood smoke over enough winters that the smell becomes part of the structure itself, undetectable to the people who live there every day, but obvious to anyone walking in fresh from outside. I want to close this part of the story by telling you a little more about what it means to be the last person alive who remembers that night firsthand, because Delphis is gone now, and Yvette is gone, and I am, as far as I know, the only living person who was actually present on that ice in 1966. That is a strange kind of solitude, different from the ordinary solitude of old age. It means that when I finally close my own eyes for the last time, whatever remains of that night that has not already been written down or spoken aloud will simply cease to exist anywhere except in whatever record I manage to leave behind, which is a large part of why I have finally chosen to tell it now in full rather than let it continue eroding quietly the way an unmarked grave erodes, unremembered back into the ground that holds it. I think often about my own father in this context, about the story he told me once at 9 years old and never repeated, about whatever weight he carried silently for the remaining 35 years of his own life after that winter of 1939. I do not know if he ever told anyone else. I do not know if there is, somewhere in Fort Kent or beyond it, another family carrying a fragment of this same knowledge as mine has carried it, unspoken across generations, each person deciding on their own whether the telling is worth the risk of not being believed, or worse, being believed too well by people who would not treat that belief with the same restraint Delphis and I spent our lives trying to practice. If there is a lesson I have taken from 81 years of living, most of them spent either working that trap line or carrying what happened on it, it is this: a mistake made in fear, in the dark, in a single unrepeatable half second, does not have to define the whole of what follows it. What follows is a choice, renewed every single day for as long as a person has days left to renew it, about whether to let that mistake calcify into something that only takes, or whether to let it soften slowly into something that gives back in whatever small ways remain available. I chose the second path, not immediately and not without decades of stumbling, but I chose it, and I believe, standing at the end of a long life and looking back at the whole shape of it, that the choosing mattered more than the mistake ever did. I have outlived nearly everyone who could contradict any detail of what I have told you here, which is a strange kind of freedom and a strange kind of loneliness both at once. Aurel Beaulieu passed in the 90s, his store long since closed in the building now a laundromat. My mother followed my father within 3 years in 1977, neither of them ever knowing the full truth of what their son carried out of that stretch of the Allagash country. I am, as I have said, the last one standing who was actually there, and I have come to understand that responsibility more than anything else as the reason this telling finally arrived when it did, rather than years earlier, or perhaps not at all. I do not know if what I did that night can ever be balanced by what came after. I am not sure grief works that way, and I am not sure it should. I have come to believe across 81 years that some debts are not meant to be closed out, only tended the way a person tends a garden that never quite finishes growing. But I know this: somewhere up along the Musquacook chain, in country that has never seen a logging road because two old friends made sure of it, there is still forest as quiet and untouched as it was the night I made the worst mistake of my life. And if that is the only gift I ever managed to give back for what I took, then I will take it gladly for as many more years as I have left to walk that trail. There is a particular hour of a winter afternoon in Aroostook County, somewhere between 3 and 4 o'clock, when the light starts to fail all at once, the way it failed on that pond in 1966, and I have never once in 60 years made it through that hour without some part of me returning to that stand of spruce, that trap, that shape crossing the ice. I do not fight it anymore. I sit with it, usually in the same chair by the same window where I have sat through thousands of failing winter afternoons, and I let the memory run its course, and when it has finished, I go on with whatever the rest of the evening requires: dinner, the news, a call from Denise, an ordinary old man's ordinary evening built on top of a foundation only I have ever fully understood. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over Aroostook County in the last weeks of January, once the holidays have passed and the days have not yet begun to lengthen in any way a person notices. And I have come to think of that quiet as belonging as much to what I carry as to the season itself. Even now, 81 years old and decades removed from a working trapline, I feel something tighten in my chest every year around the 24th, the anniversary of that night, and I have learned to let it come rather than fight it, because fighting it never once made it pass any faster. The grief written into that January scene has shaped every single year of my life since. I do not tell you this story looking for forgiveness, because I am not sure it is mine to ask for. I tell it because Yvette, in the last years of her life, told me the story deserved to outlive both of us, the same way that quiet stretch of the Allagash has outlived every hard winter it has ever faced. And because somewhere out there, I believe, in the deep timber above a pond most people will never find on any map, something is still listening, the same patient way it has been listening for 60 years for a man who never stopped coming back.